Interviews. You suck at them. So apparently, somewhere on my channel, I think I mentioned that I got offers from Google and Facebook. So now people have been asking me, how did you pass the coding interview? In this video, I'm gonna break down all of the actual content that I studied, as well as the exact resources that I used to prepare, and then the more important part, how I went about preparing and how I actually did my interviews, including the mindset and thought process that went behind everything. We're gonna go kind of fast. I don't wanna waste your time. Try to keep up. Let's go. You will absolutely need to know all of the following: iteration and recursion, multi-dimensional arrays or matrices, linked lists, queues, stacks, heaps, sets, hash maps, trees, binary search, graphs and graph traversals like depth first search, breadth first search, and backtracking, tries or trees, whatever you want to call them, and then sorting algorithms, specifically merge sort and quick sort. For each of these, you should memorize their implementation as well as the time and space complexity analysis. This is the big O notation. I'm also very glad that I practiced dynamic programming problems, which can be broken down into memoization and divide and conquer. Memoization is just storing and reusing pre-computed values and passing them through recursive calls to make your algorithm faster. Divide and conquer is just solving a subproblem of your problem, then using that to make assumptions about the full solution using something like induction. Speaking of induction, it was surprisingly helpful to practice proofs, specifically contrapositive, contradiction, proof by cases, and induction. The whole premise of an interview is to convince someone that you know what you're doing and that your ideas work, and proofs are the formal computer science way to do that. So if every single thing you say sounds like a proof, you basically win. And then finally, I'm glad I practiced problems with multiple pointers, sliding windows, greedy algorithms, and object-oriented programming. So the most useful data structure by far is going to be hash maps. This is like Ridley's side B in Smash Ultimate. If you don't know what you're doing, you can just throw hash maps at a problem. You'll probably make some progress. Storing and modifying custom values in constant time is overpowered. Use it a lot. Next up, you'll use a lot of stacks and queues. This is why a lot of people recommend Python for interviews, because you can use the built-in arrays for each of these. You don't need strict types for each case. And then after that, you'll use a lot of sets and depth first search. Make sure you are on top of all of these and know how to implement all of them. So what resources do I recommend for learning the fundamentals? Everyone online tries to outsmart the system, but if you look at these big tech companies, the people with the best success rate by far are the ones that come from theoretical CS backgrounds from top universities. So why try to argue with that? It's pretty easy to copy. I took CS 61A and 61B at UC Berkeley, and I didn't even go to class that much. You can just look up the syllabus and the course content online on like Google and YouTube. You can do that for pretty much any course. Harvard, look for CS 50, MIT, look for 6006. Carnegie Mellon and Waterloo students tend to do well, so you can look for their version of the class. Ultimately, it's the same content, data structures and algorithms, and once you cover the basics, it comes down to being good at interviewing. It's the equivalent of being a good test taker in college. So what did I use for the actual interview practice itself? Well, it was mostly LeetCode because that's what everyone uses, so it's usually up to date and the discussion forums are usually very comprehensive. I got LeetCode Premium so you could sort questions by companies that usually ask them, but you could also just sort by the types of problems and then try to go for the ones that have a very high like to dislike ratio, so you make sure that it's common questions that aren't very badly written. And then the data structures sections on HackerRank and Geeks for Geeks were pretty good. And then a lot of people use cracking the coding interview, and I didn't like it that much for learning the material. It was more of a study guide. But the author of that book made a video series on the HackerRank YouTube channel where she goes over the basic data structures, she implements them in front of you, and then walks through a lot of common problems. That was gold. So that's all of the content and all the resources that I used. The more important part is how I prepared and how I did my interviews. I think that with most things in life, it comes down to just who you are as a person. A lot of people don't like to acknowledge this and they just focus on the mechanics, the strategy, the content. But at the end of the day, if you are experienced, you know what you're doing, and you're smart, you'll be fine. And this sounds kind of pretentious, like I'm not saying I'm any of these things, but it's really hard to argue that anything else comes close to just being these three things. So why don't we just make that the target and then just break it down into actionable steps that make sense for us, and we'll probably be okay. So I'm gonna tell you what makes sense for me and my thought process. Hopefully it helps you out. So now, a controversial thought, okay? If you've been doing something for a long time, you'll probably be kind of dope at it. This is where people will ask me, wait, I've done 400 LeetCode questions. You've only done 100. Why is it that I didn't pass Facebook and you did? And my immediate response is usually, well, how did you do question, say, 358 specifically that you thought would be more successful than how you did 357? And most people in this situation will not have a specific answer. And if that's the case, then there was literally no point, because why should this have made you better on interviews? Because in this type of thing, experience isn't really measured by years or by repetitions. It's measured by the rate at which you absorb key lessons from things and the usefulness of these lessons. Basically, we need to make each one count. We don't want to be the types of people that go to the gym every day and never get more fit. So back when I was a dumb little freshman, I would just try to crank out a bunch of problems. I would make the same mistakes over and over again until I got frustrated and finally changed. And then I realized I could just proactively look for patterns and try to fix things as I was doing them. So after each problem, I started to ask, what is the one thing that I could have done or known that would have made everything else here easier? And once I figure that out, it's usually pretty obvious. Write it down, make it a rule. Every time you break it, punish yourself, celebrate it when you follow it. Do not forget it. Was I perfect at this? Absolutely not, but I learned so many important things from this. Some mistakes I avoided. So the first example, I made another video on this, writing code before you know how to solve the problem. That took me forever, but it would have taken longer if I didn't write it down and make it a rule. Another one was using multiple pointers. Either in a linked list, you're moving them at different speeds, or you're starting at different ends of an array and moving them inward. Another one is using dictionaries to count the frequencies of characters in strings, right? These are things that are just like tricks that you should have just known, but you'd be surprised how many people see so many problems of these types and then still fail questions because, oh, I didn't think to do that, right? Make it a rule, write it down, and make sure you're learning your lessons the very first time if possible. So the next question I would ask myself is, why should this one thing I just learned help me actually be better at interviewing with a whiteboard, with an interviewer, and everything? And the best approach here is to practice as realistically as possible. You know, back when I was in high school, I used to do competitive martial arts. I would train at sometimes like 6 days a week for 4 hours a day, but it was mostly like technique and conditioning. And then I would hop into a match and I would get absolutely destroyed by someone who is just a seasoned fighter, who's been there before. There's really no shortcut to getting over flinching in a fight other than just hopping in the ring. In the same way, there's no way to just shortcut handling the emotional pressure of an interview unless you just do a lot of interviews. So my approach was to just apply to every single company that I could. Do a lot of interviews, you get free flights, hotels, you get free food. It was a lot of fun, right? But then I could only do so many interviews, so the next step was to just do mock interviews. It was really hard to find people who were willing to make time to interview me and help me out, so I would just look for CS students and offer to interview them and help them. And this would still help me out a lot. It would put me in the interview setting, except eventually I ended up charging people for it. But that got kind of exhausting, so sometimes I had to just interview myself. I would set a timer to have the actual time pressure. I would stand up like it's an actual on-site interview, stand in front of a whiteboard and so on. And I really should have been talking out my solutions to a camera, because that probably would have made starting on YouTube a lot easier, but I did what I could. And this really came down to training my imagination to pretend that every little problem was the actual thing. And this sounds painful and it's like a lot of work, but it's a lot less painful than failing interviews. And if you can't force yourself to go through a mock interview, why do you deserve to do well on the actual thing? So really the point of this is to over time develop a system for doing interviews that you've proven through realistic scenarios. And this brings me to the next step: know what you're doing. So one thing that I actually learned from trading in the stock market is that you never want to let things come down to how you behave in the moment, right? Because humans are trash at those situations. That's just how we're wired. When possible, you want to rely on habits, rules, and systems. Ideally, you want some algorithm for solving algorithm problems. Like, it's never going to be exact, but this kind of approach is what we're going for. For example, when the interviewer finishes explaining the problem and then hands it off to you, what are the first things you do immediately? For the longest time, I didn't have a formal answer to this. I was kind of just winging it, but then I started to formalize it, and now what I usually do is just exploit everything that you're given already. For example, the description of the problem, the sample input and the output, and the constraints. You also have a whiteboard and a shared screen, so it makes sense to combine all of these with visualizations. There's a reason why interview questions usually aren't literal. They don't ask you like, oh, you have two arrays with these values, transform them such that blah, blah, blah. They're usually usually in the form of some cute like visual narrative. For example, cars on a freeway moving at different speeds, how many different groups of cars get to the end? Or you have water flowing in a valley, how many different basins does the water flow into? Like, there's a reason why it's in the form of these cute little stories, because these are easier to comprehend mentally, visualize on a whiteboard, and communicate in plain English. So why not use that to your advantage? So while I'm listening to the problem, every phrase, I will try to represent that phrase exactly on a drawing on the whiteboard, very literally, and then move on to the next one, add that to my diagram, and then go on. So that by the time I'm finished hearing the problem, I will have a diagram that represents every single part of this. A lot of people fail interview questions because they don't understand the question, or it takes a lot of effort to process what they heard. If you have a diagram that has every part of the problem already, you will not need to rethink it. It takes a lot off your cognitive load. You can just look at the picture and go from there. And then you have your sample input and output. And because you have a diagram, you can just draw these into your diagram, draw the input, and then manually transform it into the output in your actual visualization. And if you're able to do that, which you're supposed to be able to do, then you do know an algorithm for solving the problem. It's just subconscious. Then it just comes down to translating it to code and formalizing it such that it handles every single case. But interview questions are designed so that you can get an input and intuitively figure out the output. Otherwise, there is no way that they'll be able to verify if your solution is correct or not. So the best example I can think of is reversing a linked list. Why is this such a meme on tech YouTube? Well, that's because if you draw it out on a whiteboard and you ask someone to reverse the drawing, they will be able to do it. You just erase the arrows and you point them the other direction. But when you ask them to code it, a lot of people will struggle. But if you can reverse the drawing, the code is just doing the exact same thing. Just look at what you did and then code that. So then translating from the drawing to the code is really just asking a series of questions. Why is this one step hard to code? I just did it in the drawing. Oh, I lost a reference to the previous node, so it would be cool to have a temporary pointer right there so I can point back to it and so on. And you just keep doing that. So ultimately, knowing what you're doing in interviews comes down to just having a series of questions that you tend to ask in the same situations around the same times in most interviews. So for example, why is this hard to code? What assumptions can I make about the problem that would make this easier? What is my big O runtime? What's the next best big O? Why is this possible or is it not possible? Where's the repeated work happening? Does this need to happen? Is there anything I could have computed during my first pass through the input that would have made me need fewer passes? So another thing I will always do is try to make the coding part seem trivial. I'll explain my solution in plain English and say, oh, assuming that I have code that makes each of these steps work, this solution works. And then I'll break it down into English step-by-step bullet points and say, okay, assuming that each line does what it says it does, this solution works. And then go to pseudocode, make sure that each thing does as expected, and then break it into function names and then implement the functions, right? You wanna go top down. This makes sure that your interviewer knows you're methodical and that the problem isn't the coding, right? I also found it helpful to bounce ideas and verify my runtimes, my assumptions, and my approaches with the interviewer at every step of the way. I'll try to come up with a plan on the go, explain what I'm gonna do, and then do that thing. If every step of your process sounds reasonable, even if it's incorrect, the interviewer won't doubt your competency. It's just a matter of mistakes, but not because you don't know what you're doing. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to the interview itself, I could have all the right approaches, all the right preparation, do all the right things, and then still get stuck. I never understood how people got themselves unstuck, how to go from nothing into something. And it seemed like the only thing you can really do is just be smart. And this sounds like a lazy answer, like a cop-out, but this is actually something we can understand and practice, because how do we make computers smart? Computers explore effectively, they learn right away, they're deterministic, and they move very fast. And we can actually apply this to ourselves through creativity, self-awareness, consistency, and intensity. I'm pretty bad at all of these, but all we can do is just work on them. So creativity, well, once again, that's just asking questions, making relevant but creative assumptions about the problem space or a potential solution, and then convincing yourself if this is or isn't the case. And then self-awareness, that's just understanding when you're going down the wrong path and then immediately correcting yourself. So things I would do are mindfulness meditation, as cringy as that sounds, and having my friends roast the shit out of me. Then Consistency, you kind of got to just do it every day and make it a habit. And then intensity, that one's kind of hard to strategize, right? That's just the inner voice in your head that says, do it. That's your level of mental engagement and accuracy in the moment. Your ability to just get in the zone and brain blast. I can't really give you advice. You got to find whatever works for you. For me, I tried a bunch of things, right? Drinking caffeine, yelling at myself in the mirror, listening to smoke perp. But I think what makes the biggest difference for me is reminding myself of the satisfaction I'll feel after passing an interview. This feeling of personal achievement and really imagining it and reminding myself of it every day. And I think this is the defining factor for most things in life, because really we're all human. We all have the same physical limitations, more or less. We all have 24 hours in a day. Even among people with the same background, the same content, at the same school, only some people make it work out. And I think this is the separator, the motivation. And this is kind of overplayed. Everybody says this because it's kind of true. Find the thing that makes you want it. And this could be what pushes you to become the person you see as successful, build your own system for doing so, and then prove that to yourself through experience, and then smash the subscribe button and then pass your interviews. Hopefully you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.